We're still on progressivism. We're now going to talk about there are really three big presidents in progressivism, and that's Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and also Woodrow Wilson. So we're going to talk about two of those today, and then we'll talk about Wilson tomorrow. All right, so here we go. Teddy Roosevelt was put on a ticket with William McKinley when William McKinley will be reelected, just because they wanted to get him out of New York. They didn't like him, and so they said, well, what better way? Let's make him vice president, and he'll die there, and so what happens? But an interesting thing happens here. William McKinley will be shot by a man known as Leon Kozolga. I probably butchered that name. Now, why did he shoot the president? He was an anarchist, and he did not believe in any form of government. He thought that the government was corrupt. And so with McKinley out of the picture, as they called him, the cowboy will take the White House. Now, why they call him cowboy was because he was a rough rider during the Spanish-American War, which we'll talk about coming up in imperialism. Remember, imperialism and progressivism are mirroring each other, so these people will pop up again. Promise. So let's talk about Teddy Roosevelt and what he did. All right? Now, an interesting thing here, and this is, I'll leave it at this. This was around the turn of the century here, and so William McKinley could have been saved because Thomas Edison had actually invented an X-ray machine, which is what you see here at a World's Fair. And McKinley basically said, hey, I'm not going to let that weirdo put something near me. It worked. It could have possibly saved him. Just by his own arrogance and not wanting to try something new, he died. It's interesting, right? Now, Teddy Roosevelt, he has a lot of memorable quotes, right? Here's just one here. We wish peace, but we wish the peace of justice, peace of righteousness. We wish it because we think it is right and because we are not afraid. Now, there's a veiled thing going on here. He's basically saying, if you don't like us, we're going to make you like us. He's called a bully. He's called many different things, all right? Now, Teddy Roosevelt's plan for America was called the Square Deal because all four sides would be equal. And so what was his square deal all about? Well, he wants to protect consumers. He wants to, and that means, pure food and drug. That means different things like that. He wanted conservation. That was his baby. He wanted to become an imperial. He wanted to have a large military, naval bases. He wanted to be feared. And then lastly, he wanted to continue making money. And so these are the things that work on here, and we're going to talk about each one. Now, there's just one thing for square deal. It's kind of funny, right? Let's talk about this. Teddy Roosevelt is going to be the first president, and really the only one to use his office as what he called a bully pulpit. Now, a pulpit is something you preach from church, and if you bully somebody, you intimidate them. This was often said when he went to Congress to get what he wanted. He was actually so persuasive they would give in, okay? And so for this reason, another nickname he gets outside of Teddy is Bully. And I have a book there on my shelf that has many political cartoons entitled Bully, all right? Now, we have a major thing occur around the turn of the century as well. It's the Anthrite coal strike. Basically, coal was used in 1906 for everything. And the people who were mining it said, we're not making enough money. There is a union, right? Remember how people perceive unions at this time. Think back to the Haymarket riot. And they threatened to go on strike. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is not proactive. Or, I'm sorry, he is proactive. He's not going to sit back. He's not going to send the federal troops. He goes himself. He arbitrates the dispute. And he takes them head on because he sees it as a national threat. Because what is the coal doing? It's making us money. And so if you're threatening my money, you're threatening me. And so he basically went in there and made sure he found a way to end this. And so this shows you another thing about Teddy Roosevelt. He is not afraid of getting in the middle of something. Arbitration. Keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, around the same time as well, the Sherman Antitrust is enacted. And the idea was to take down the big giants. You can see them right here, right? The most notable one here is J.P. Morgan. We have John D. Rockefeller back here. Now, what story are they playing off here? They're playing off David and Goliath, or Jack and the Wall Street Giants in the same story. But the idea here is that the president, that's supposed to be Teddy right there, will take on these trusts because of the Sherman Antitrust Act and knock them down to size. Now, what did the Sherman antitrust say? It said that there could be no attempt to make a monopoly in this country that would interfere with trade. And so we think that Teddy Roosevelt, for this reason, garners a third nickname, Trust Buster. But wait a minute. If he is to bust the trust, that will mean he would take them down, right? So look at this political cartoon and you tell me what's going on here. Teddy Roosevelt, guy has a trust, has antitrust laws, and he's telling him to stop. Why would he tell him to stop? Because Teddy Roosevelt was not a true trust buster. The real trust buster would be Woodrow Wilson. We'll get to him later on. Teddy Roosevelt actually took the trust case in a case-by-case basis. And he basically said, if it's a good trust, meaning it will make us money, and we'll do the competition, etc., he allowed it to stay. If it was a bad trust, he eliminated it. Now again, remember, this is him talking here, and so he has a lot of power here. But that is it. He's not a true trust buster. All right? And so there you have it, right? We have good trust with restraint, and we have the bad trust that he's actually killed. You can tell that, right? And so he's outside the White House, and you can tell he's restraining him. The bad trust has been shot, and so that's interesting, right? Now they use bear, of course, and we'll get to that later on. Now the first trust he will try to go after is the trust of Northern Securities. Northern Securities was a subsidy of Standard Oil. It had a lot of control, and so you have the baby president going after this massive two-headed snake, and what ultimately happened is they ruled in favor of Teddy Roosevelt, and so Northern Securities is broken up into many, many countries, or many, many companies in the country, sorry. And so the idea here is that Northern Securities is the first trust busted up by Teddy because he saw it as being bad. Had it been good, he would have allowed it to continue. Now, let's see here. Yeah. We have two acts in Congress that will further Teddy's control over the most precious commodity we have, and that would be the railroad. And that would be the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act, all right? The Elkins Act we have here, right? And he has it on his big stick, which we'll get to that later on. It says greater railroad regulation. Elkins Act allowed the Congress, mainly, to jump in and regulate the railroad. Regulate means, again, to keep an eye over, to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to. And that's what Teddy really was about, regulating, not busting. The second act comes out later on. It's called the Hepburn Act. And so again, we have real federal regulation, and we have Hepburn line. Now, what does that mean? This said that a big railroad could not come out and force a smaller railroad out of business. You have to keep them in there. So even if it's a small line, like the Hepburn line, you have to allow them to coexist. You have to allow them to do things as they are. And so these two kind of combine and give more federal regulation over these things. Now, the next two things we need to talk about are probably the most important. Yesterday we talked about The Jungle, correct? It was made into a motion picture, but the idea here is, remember, it's about the meat packing industry. And so Roosevelt is so horrified, he goes and he nominates two things. The first one is called the Pure Food and Drug Act. Only the best. Okay, and the idea was to protect what people were going into their bodies, make sure it was good. Again, as I said, this is on your meat where it says USDA. Or I'm sorry, no, I'm not to that one yet. Sorry. This is the FDA. Is morphed out of that, and so the idea here is that everything that is consumable by Americans must be evaluated by the FDA, or if you do so at your own risk. And so you have to be very careful, especially with vitamins or health food supplements. Football players taking creatine. I mean, just make sure you're knowing what you're putting into your body. And so the FDA, if they don't approve it, you're doing something that if something happens to you, there's really nothing you can do about it. Okay? Now, the other thing is, going into this was the meat of what on earth are we putting into our bodies. And so here we have President Roosevelt with the investigation rake, the meat rakers, and we have the meat scandal. And so here it is in the meatpacking plant. And there was just horrifying stories here of using embalming fluid to preserve the meat. And that would get into, that's the same stuff they put in dead bodies. And so bits of rope and rat and all kinds of horrible stuff. And so what he sets up out of this is the Meat Inspection Act. It is this little sticker here. It also says USDA grade. And so the idea is, if it's not got this, you're hurting yourself. All right. And so that's Teddy Roosevelt. Some of the acts he's going into. The next section we're going to look at is one of his pet projects, conservation. And this is vastly different to what we've talked about before with westward expansion.